The low murmur of the International Hotel swelled like static in the air. Glasses clinked, laughter rippled from velvet-draped tables, and the scent of cigars curled lazily beneath the chandeliers. Somewhere in the back, a dealer fresh off the casino floor whispered wagers on how long the king would last before falling flat. Then the announcer's voice cut through the haze, polished and theatrical. "Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis Presley." A surge from the orchestra, brass blaring, drums rolling like thunder. The spotlight swept toward the curtain, every eye turning, waiting for the legend to appear. But before he stepped out, the focus lingered elsewhere. A table near the front, where a woman in diamonds leaned close to her companion. Her painted lips curved with disdain. "Look at him," she murmured, her words sharp as broken glass. "Back again, in those glittering costumes. He looks like a circus clown." Her laughter, high, deliberate, broke the air. A few around her chuckled, eager to show they shared her superiority. And just like that, a crack appeared in the room's anticipation, a ripple of mockery beneath the grandeur. The lights dimmed, the curtain trembled, and still the man himself had yet to take a single step onto the stage. The hall waited, between admiration and ridicule, between spectacle and silence, for Elvis Presley's first word. "Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story." The elevator doors opened with a soft, metallic sigh, releasing a waft of perfume, cigar smoke, and the faint trace of whiskey from the lobby bar below. Beyond the threshold stretched the grand corridor of the International Hotel in Las Vegas. The year was 1970, and every inch of the building seemed engineered to shout luxury. Crimson carpets, gilded wall sconces, mirrored panels that threw back distorted fragments of passing guests in gowns and tuxedos. At the far end of the hall waited the showroom, the largest in the city. Inside, nearly 2,000 people were settling into their seats. The men wore tailored suits with bow ties snug around their necks, and the women glimmered in evening dresses that caught the reflection of the chandeliers overhead. The wealthy elite of Vegas had come not out of devotion, but curiosity. They wanted to see for themselves whether the man once crowned King of Rock and Roll could still matter in an era when the Beatles had broken America, when the Rolling Stones prowled stadiums, when youth culture had moved past the pompadour and sideburns. To many in the room, Elvis Presley was a relic, an artifact from another decade, now wrapped in rhinestones like a circus act. Some had come to sneer as much as to listen. From the bar, the clink of glasses mixed with muttered laughter. A woman in a silk shawl leaned toward her companion and whispered with an arched eyebrow, "I wonder if he'll wiggle his hips like he used to." "My grandson does the same at birthday parties." Her friend stifled a laugh behind a jeweled fan. Near the front, a journalist sat with a notebook balanced on his knee. He had been dispatched by a New York magazine, already sharpening the blade of his review in his mind. He scribbled observations with the cool detachment of a man expecting disappointment. Gaudy room, crowd restless, performer untested in years. Every few seconds he glanced toward the curtain at stage right, as though daring it to open and confirm his assumptions. Behind that curtain, in the narrow space reserved for the band and stagehands, Elvis Presley stood in silence. The noise of the crowd bled through the velvet fabric, but he barely heard it. He tugged once at the cuff of his white jumpsuit, the new design stitched with golden trim that shimmered beneath the backstage bulbs. The garment clung snug to his frame, heavy with embroidery and studded stones. It was bold, deliberately so. And yet he knew how it looked to certain eyes. In the press of the late 60s, he had read the words, "costumed clown," Vegas Peacock, parody of his former self. The words had stung more than he ever admitted. He had spent years mired in Hollywood contracts, churning out films he knew were beneath him, watching the cultural tide wash over rock music and leave him stranded on the shore. Now, at 35, he had clawed his way back onto a real stage. But with that comeback came the sneering question: was Elvis still Elvis, or just a man trapped inside an impersonation of himself? He rolled his shoulders, exhaled, and touched the edge of his belt buckle, an oversized piece of brass that gleamed like armor. The jumpsuit wasn't vanity, it was statement. He had designed it with his tailor to borrow from the GI of martial artists, the high collar recalling the images of superheroes he had admired as a boy. The cape, when he chose to wear it, wasn't comedy. It was theater. He believed in spectacle, in giving an audience more than just notes and chords. If they came to laugh, let them. He would give them something unforgettable. Still, nerves pressed against his chest like a hand. He knew some of the men in the crowd, the casino magnates, the hotel investors, considered him a hired novelty, a profitable attraction no different than the roulette wheel. They sat with their cigars and their contempt, watching for weakness. He could almost feel their eyes already on him, measuring him before he had even sung a syllable. From the other side of the curtain came a fragment of sound, a short, sharp laugh. A woman's laugh, high-pitched, carrying just enough for him to catch. "Let's see the king in his crown," she said, not caring who overheard. The words slid under his skin. He kept his expression still, but his jaw tightened. Joe Esposito, his longtime aide, touched his arm. "EP, you're on in 30 seconds." Elvis nodded, though his mind was still on the laugh, the whisper, the judgment already made against him. He had lived with doubt before, but tonight it was different. Tonight, they weren't mocking the boy from Tupelo who rose too fast. They were mocking the man who dared to return. The band struck its opening cue, a surge of brass and drums that rattled the floorboards. The lights dimmed across the hall, leaving only the glow of the stage. The audience hushed in anticipation, conversations snapping off mid-sentence. Even the mocking voices quieted, waiting to see what kind of apparition would step through the veil. Elvis drew a breath. In that instant, he remembered the bare church halls of his childhood, the cheap guitar strings biting his fingers, the long years of hunger and hope. He remembered his mother's voice, telling him he was meant for something greater. The memory steadied him like a hand on his back. The curtain began to rise. A single spotlight cut across the smoke-thick air of the showroom and caught the sequins on his suit, scattering light like shattered glass. For a heartbeat, the audience only saw a silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, a figure outlined in white fire. Then he stepped forward into the glare. Gasps mingled with murmurs. Some clapped instinctively. Others simply stared, lips curled faintly in derision. The woman in the silk shawl raised her chin, eyes narrowing as though to say, "Prove it." Elvis Presley stood at center stage, his head bowed slightly, microphone in hand. He hadn't sung a note, but already the battle lines were drawn. In the smoky hush of the International Hotel, he could feel it. The weight of their judgment, the edge of their laughter, the hunger of those waiting for him to fall. He lifted his eyes to the crowd. His smile flickered. Calm, measured, not quite hiding the steel underneath. Whatever came next would decide everything. The brass hit again, a blaring fanfare that filled the hall with a shimmer of sound. Spotlights swept across the room, catching the edges of champagne flutes and the diamonds on manicured fingers. Then they converged on him. Elvis lifted the microphone, tilting it just slightly, and the band fell into the unmistakable riff. It was "That's All Right," the song that had carried him from a Memphis studio to the ears of the world almost 2 decades earlier. The choice wasn't accidental. He wanted to remind them where it all began. The guitar licks danced sharp and bright, like sparks off steel, and the drums snapped with a martial drive. As he opened his mouth, the first line rolled out not as nostalgia, but as a challenge. His voice was richer now than in the 50s, deeper in its chest tones yet still edged with that boyish electricity. The sound cut clean through the thick air of the showroom. For a moment, even the chatter of the bar stilled. Heads turned. Forks paused halfway to plates. But not everyone fell silent. In the second row, the woman in the silk shawl let out a laugh, short, derisive, meant to be heard. "All that shine for a jukebox tune," she muttered, loud enough that those around her shifted uncomfortably. Her jeweled earrings swung as she shook her head, and the movement caught the stage lights, turning her disdain into a small performance of its own. Up in the booth, a sound engineer wearing thick padded headphones caught the disturbance in his peripheral vision. He frowned. His hands hovered over the sliders. If Presley lost focus, if the heckling wormed its way into the rhythm, it could throw the entire opening. The man had seen lesser performers unravel under less. His knuckles whitened on the console. On stage, Elvis caught the words. They reached him between beats, slinking through the pause before the chorus. His eyes flicked toward the second row. He saw her clearly now. High cheekbones, painted lips, the kind of cultivated glamour that money could buy in Vegas. Her laugh was a blade, and she knew it. He didn't falter. Instead, his mouth curved into the faintest smile, a private smile that didn't quite touch his eyes. The lyric continued, but the timbre shifted. More bite, more grit, as though he were carving the words into the air rather than simply singing them. The band, sensing the change, drove harder, their instruments thundering as if in defense. The audience felt it too. A ripple ran through the rows, a tightening of shoulders, a leaning forward, a subtle recognition that something unscripted was unfolding. The journalist in the front row paused his pen, mid-sentence, sensing drama before it took form. He glanced quickly from Presley to the woman, anticipating a story richer than the routine concert review he had expected to file. Midway through the second verse, Elvis made his decision. Instead of cruising into the chorus, he lifted a hand, palm outward. The band, trained to his cues, fell back instinctively. The guitar strings hung unresolved, the brass softened, and the drums thudded once into silence. The audience exhaled in confusion. What was happening? Elvis lowered the mic closer to his lips. He didn't sing. He spoke. "Now, friends," he began, his voice low but carrying, "I hear some of y'all think these clothes are a joke, that I'm standing here like some kind of decoration." He glanced down at the golden trim of his jumpsuit, then back to the sea of faces. His tone was easy, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. A shiver of attention passed through the crowd. Conversations died instantly. Even the gamblers, who had come only to flaunt their luck, felt a pulse of unease. Nobody had expected Presley to stop the music and break the wall. The woman in the second row tittered again, as if to remind the room she hadn't been silenced. But this time, the sound fell flat. It bounced awkwardly against the hush that had descended. A man beside her shifted in his seat, clearly irritated. Elvis leaned an elbow on the mic stand, casual as if in his own living room, though his eyes locked sharp on the audience. "I'll tell you something," he said, letting the words roll out slow. "This here suit, it ain't a joke to me. It's not for circus tricks. It's for fightin', for standin' tall. I wear it 'cause it tells the truth about where I come from and what I believe." The silence that followed was taut, strung like wire. Somewhere at the back of the room, ice clinked against glass, the only sound. Then, without warning, he straightened, gave the mic stand a spin, and snapped the band back into gear with a flick of his wrist. The drummer pounded, the horns flared, and the music roared alive again. He surged into the chorus, stronger now, his voice carrying the weight of defiance. The shift electrified the room. Cheers erupted from scattered corners, spreading like brush fire until the applause threatened to drown the song itself. The journalist scribbled furiously, his neat script turning jagged in the rush. But in the midst of the noise, Elvis's gaze returned once more to the second row. The woman smiled tightly, lips pressed, but her earlier confidence faltered. She had meant to provoke a stumble. Instead, she had provoked a storm. Elvis drove into the last verse with a ferocity that surprised even the band. His body moved with instinct, hips rolling, shoulders snapping with the beat. But it wasn't parody. It was command. Every movement claimed the stage as his own. Every note wrestled back authority from doubt. The final chord slammed shut like a door, and for half a breath, the room froze in suspended silence. Then the applause thundered, rolling over the stage like a tide. Elvis stood tall, chest heaving, a sheen of sweat already beading on his brow. He raised a hand in thanks, but said nothing. The audience had seen the first crackle of fire. They didn't yet know he had only just begun. The applause still echoed, bouncing against the mirrored walls and velvet curtains, when Elvis did something that startled even the band. Instead of plunging into the next number on the set list, he tightened his grip on the microphone and held it steady. The brass players froze with their instruments raised. The drummer lifted his sticks and waited. Elvis didn't give the cue. He simply stood, the spotlight fixed on him, his chest rising and falling with deliberate slowness. The noise from the audience began to ebb as people realized something was happening. Conversations dwindled to murmurs, then to silence. Even the clinking of ice in glasses stilled as waiters hesitated mid-pour. He tilted his head slightly, lips curved in that half-smile of his, playful but edged with something firmer. Then he spoke, not sang. "You know," he said, the southern lilt rolling warm but sharp, "I keep hearin' folks say these suits of mine are a joke, that they're too loud, too bright, too much." He gestured down at the jeweled belt and golden embroidery flashing under the lights. "But let me tell you why I wear 'em." The crowd leaned in. They hadn't expected a lecture. They had come for songs, yet his tone carried a current that demanded attention. It wasn't defensive. It was explanatory, almost confessional, yet filled with quiet steel. "These outfits," he continued, running a hand along the collar, "ain't costumes from a carnival. They come from something real. The high collar, the cut of the sleeves, they're based on the robes of martial artists, men who fought with discipline, with respect. And I thought, if I'm gonna step out here and fight for music every night, I ought to wear something that shows it." His eyes scanned the rows of faces, pausing just long enough for people to feel he was speaking directly to them. "They're not about flashin' wealth or making a circus. They're about strength, about freedom, about walking out here and saying, 'This is me and I ain't ashamed.'" The woman in the second row, who had laughed so freely before, let out a small scoff, intending to reclaim the moment. But the sound landed wrong this time. It rang thin, brittle, swallowed by the silence of hundreds who were now listening with rapt attention. A few heads turned her way, irritation flickering in their eyes. Her smirk faltered. Elvis caught it, but didn't pause. Instead, his smile sharpened. "Now, Some may still say I look like a clown." His voice dropped lower, almost conspiratorial. "Well, maybe so. But if this clown's managed to sell more records than anyone else in the history of rock and roll, I reckon that ain't too bad." The line struck like a spark in dry grass. Laughter burst from the back rows, rolling forward into applause, swelling into cheers. Hands clapped, feet stomped, and even those who had sat stiff and aloof earlier found themselves grinning despite their pride. The journalist's pen raced across the page. He had just been handed a headline, and he knew it. Elvis let the reaction rise, then settle, never rushing. He stood calm, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. Then, with the ease of a man turning a page, he nodded to the band. The drummer snapped his sticks together. The guitarist hit a downstroke. A fresh surge of music erupted, fierce and insistent. But this time, the energy wasn't only coming from the stage, it was bouncing back from the crowd. Applause blended with rhythm, shouts punctuated the beat, and the International Hotel showroom shifted from a place of skepticism into something electric. Elvis threw himself into the next song, not the ballad originally scripted, but a harder, faster number chosen on instinct. His hips swung, his knees bent, and the mic stand became almost a partner in motion as he drove the tempo higher. It wasn't rebellion for its own sake. It was statement, an answer in rhythm and melody to the doubts that had filled the room. And in the second row, the woman who had mocked him sat frozen, her earlier bravado slipping like a mask that no longer fit. Around her, the tide had turned. She was no longer leading the laughter. She was stranded in it. The room thundered with approval. Every line Elvis sang landed like a hammer against doubt. Every chord from the band sounded like vindication. By the time the song reached its climax, people were on their feet. Not just die-hard fans, but casino owners, wealthy tourists, businessmen who had crossed their arms earlier in the night. They rose because they couldn't help themselves, because something undeniable had taken hold of the room. Elvis ended with a flourish, one knee bent, hand extended, sweat shining along his jaw. The chord slammed shut. The applause was instant and overwhelming, rising in waves that shook the chandeliers. For a moment, he stayed frozen in the pose, eyes steady, letting the crowd release their roar. Inside, though, he knew it wasn't only the song that had won them. It was the words. Words instead of notes. Truth instead of mockery. And now, they were his. The hall still trembled with applause when Elvis shifted his weight and eased into the next number. His breathing was steady now, the adrenaline no longer a burden but a current he could ride. The band picked up the cue, sliding into a smoother groove, the brass cushioned with velvet tones and the guitar lines weaving soft heat through the air. The energy in the room had changed. Where minutes ago there had been doubt, even derision, now there was eagerness. Eyes that once measured him coldly now followed his every move. Even those who came merely to drink and gossip leaned forward, unwilling to miss what might happen next. Elvis closed his eyes briefly, let the rhythm settle, then opened them again. The stage lights glared, but he could see faces clearly in the first rows. Some were beaming, others contemplative, but most were locked on him with the kind of focus every performer longs for. And then, cutting across the tide of music and attention, came the sound again. The same voice that had pierced him earlier. In the second row, the woman in the silk shawl leaned toward her companion and spoke, her words sharp enough to slice through the melody. "Common crowds will buy this, sure, but real artists don't dress themselves up as spectacles." She hadn't raised her voice much, but the sentence carried. Those around her stiffened. A man 2 seats away frowned openly. A woman in the row behind muttered under her breath. The dissonance was small, yet in a room so tightly wound with energy, it rang louder than it should have. On stage, Elvis caught it. The line reached him like a stone skipping across water. For a heartbeat, his jaw tightened, but his voice never faltered. The note held, the lyrics spilled without crack. He was too seasoned to let a single heckle break the surface. Still, he saw the ripple it caused. 2 young fans sitting just behind the woman exchanged a look, their faces flushed with frustration. One of them gripped the armrest, his lips parting as if he might shout something back. But hesitation bound him. They didn't want to ruin the night. They wanted Elvis to handle it his way. From his place at the piano, one of the orchestra players nearly stumbled, anger flaring in his expression as the insult reached his ears. But Elvis, catching it, gave the faintest motion with his hand. "Steady. Keep playing." His musicians obeyed, trusting him to steer the storm. The journalist at the front had heard it too. He bent over his notepad, his pen scratching rapidly. He wasn't sure what to expect, but instinct told him. Something memorable was about to unfold. As the final verse approached, Elvis lifted his gaze deliberately toward the second row. His eyes were calm, not mocking, but direct enough that people began turning their heads to see who he was looking at. The woman straightened slightly as though bracing. Her companion shifted uncomfortably. The song ended on a sustained chord, the brass glowing like molten gold, the drums thundering one last time. Applause surged, but Elvis lifted his hand for silence. Slowly, it came. He leaned into the microphone, voice low but clear. "You know, there's an old saying from back home. Never judge a man till you've walked a mile in his shoes." The words hung in the air, simple, unpolished, but heavy with resonance. For a moment, nobody moved. Then a swell of reaction burst loose. Cheers, whistles, hands slapping together with fresh force. The phrase, borrowed from folk wisdom, carried more weight than any defense could have. It reframed the mockery, turned it inside out. The woman sat stiff, color creeping into her cheeks. Her friend avoided her eyes. Around her, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Where she had once led the smirks, now she was isolated, an island in a sea that had moved firmly to Presley's side. Elvis didn't gloat. He simply straightened, offered a quick nod, and spun back to the band. The next number began, brisk and triumphant, and the hall roared to meet it. The confrontation was done, without raised voices, without hostility, only a proverb delivered at the perfect moment. And in that single gesture, the room was his again, utterly and completely. The applause rolled on, swelling like waves against a shore, but Elvis didn't ride it with another high-tempo number. Instead, he raised his hand and the band quieted, leaving a sudden stillness. The shift surprised the audience, who expected the momentum to keep rising. He motioned for a stool to be brought to center stage. As the lights softened, he slung a guitar over his shoulder, the instrument gleaming under the spotlight. The orchestra fell silent. Even the waiters hesitated to move between the aisles. The spectacle had collapsed into intimacy. Elvis sat, adjusting the guitar against his knee, and strummed a single chord. The sound was warm, unembellished, like the wooden pews of a small-town church. He paused, glanced over the crowd, then began to speak in a tone stripped of theatrics. "You know, when I was a boy in Tupelo, Mississippi," he said, voice carrying with a husky honesty, "my mama used to patch my clothes till her fingers bled. We didn't have much. Truth is, most times we had nothing at all. And when I wanted something different to wear, I'd try to sew it myself. Folks laughed at me then, too. Said I looked foolish. Said I was putting on airs. The showroom stilled. Men in tuxedos leaned back. Women in sequined gowns tilted forward, listening despite themselves. His words weren't a rehearsed anecdote. They sounded too raw, too lived in. He strummed another gentle chord. I remember one night, before a school talent show. I'd made a shirt out of scraps, stitched it by hand, thought it looked sharp. But before I even sang a note, some of the boys jeered. They didn't hear the music, they only saw what I wore, and it hurt. But I went on anyway. And singing that night, I found something that couldn't be mocked. A hush clung to the air. In the second row, the woman who had mocked him earlier shifted uncomfortably. Her painted confidence was thinning. The friend beside her now gave her a sidelong look, less indulgent, more reproachful. Elvis lowered his eyes briefly, letting silence stretch. "So, when I walk out in rhinestones now," he said softly, "I don't do it for show. I do it because, once upon a time, a boy from Tupelo didn't have a dime, and he dreamed of standing tall enough that nobody could laugh him down again." The line struck deep. People who had come armored in cynicism suddenly found their guard crumbling. The weight of his past sat heavy over the room, and for a flicker, the distance between millionaire patrons and a poor Southern boy collapsed. Without warning, Elvis began to pick out the tender opening notes of a song. The melody was instantly familiar, gentle, yearning. His voice, when it entered, carried none of the bravado of earlier numbers. It was delicate, tremulous, as though he were singing to someone across a quiet porch rather than a vast showroom. "Love me tender." The lyric unfurled like a prayer. His phrasing was slower than on the record, each word rounded with care. The hall transformed. The restless shuffling ceased. The clink of glasses vanished. Even the waitstaff stopped, trays balanced in midair, drawn into the stillness. The room became, for those minutes, a chapel. In the middle rows, a casino magnate known for his cynicism blinked rapidly, as if trying to dislodge an emotion he hadn't invited. A woman in a fur stole dabbed at the corner of her eyes with her napkin. Couples, strangers, even hardened businessmen felt a thread tugging at something they had long buried. The camera in the mind of every witness would have captured it. Elvis seated in white, golden trim glinting faintly, guitar against his chest, voice weaving a spell so fragile it seemed it might break if anyone dared breathe too loudly. By the time the last note faded, silence flooded the room. Not awkward silence, not hesitation, but reverent quiet, heavy with the realization that they had been given something unvarnished, something few expected from the man they had come to judge. Then came the eruption. Applause like thunder, shouts of devotion, hands slamming together with abandon. People rose to their feet, not all at once, but in waves, until nearly the entire showroom stood. The ovation seemed reluctant to stop, rolling on, louder, until the sound itself seemed to shake the chandeliers. Elvis sat still for a beat, guitar resting across his lap, head slightly bowed. When he finally looked up, there was a glimmer in his eyes, of memory, of gratitude, of quiet triumph. For a moment, even the harshest critics forgot their prepared dismissals. What they had seen was not a spectacle in sequins. It was a man who had reached back into the raw fabric of his own past and laid it bare, with nothing but 6 strings and a trembling voice. And the room knew, without needing to say it, that this was no circus. This was truth. When the final chord of "Love Me Tender" dissolved into the hushed air, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The room seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a stillness more powerful than any applause could have been. Then, slowly at first, the ovation erupted. It wasn't the polite clapping of casino regulars or the dutiful response of socialites. It was raw, thunderous, and prolonged, an outpouring from people who had been unexpectedly pierced at the heart. Elvis rose from the stool, slipping the guitar strap from his shoulder. He stood tall, the spotlight tracing the sheen of sweat on his face. He reached for the microphone again, ready to give the band its cue. But before he could, a voice broke through the storm of applause. From the rear of the room, a man's shout cut across the din. "Elvis, sing the way only you can. We love you for being real." The declaration hit like a lightning strike. Heads turned, then turned back to Presley, waiting for his response. And in that instant, the energy of the entire hall shifted. The applause grew louder, more unified, swelling until it was impossible to distinguish individuals. Every clap, every cheer, fused into a single tidal roar. Up front, the woman in the silk shawl stiffened. Her earlier smirks and barbs now seemed faint, irrelevant in the face of such solidarity. Where once her laughter had commanded attention, now it was drowned beneath the unified cry of admiration. She sat isolated, a lone island in an ocean of voices raised for someone else. One of the hotel's security men approached her row. He bent discreetly, speaking low but firm. "Ma'am, there have been complaints. Please keep it respectful." She gasped, affronted, her lips parting to argue, but around her she felt the weight of disapproval. Glares from nearby patrons, the cold shoulders of her peers. Slowly, bitterly, she folded her arms and sank into silence. Elvis had watched the exchange without a word. He didn't need to intervene. Instead, he turned back to the crowd, lifted the microphone, and let a wry smile cross his face. His next words were not rehearsed. They rose from somewhere deeper, born from the moment itself. "You know something, friends," he said, his drawl softened but steady. "I'd rather be a clown with a heart than lose my heart trying to be something I ain't." The sentence detonated inside the hall. People leapt to their feet, clapping, whistling, shouting his name. The ovation was not just approval, it was vindication, a collective answer to the doubt and mockery that had hovered earlier. For the first time that evening, the audience wasn't simply watching Elvis, they were with him, bound together by his words. The orchestra, cued by his nod, struck up the opening of a rousing number. The beat was sharp, insistent, carrying the energy of the room higher still. Elvis moved with it, hips loose, shoulders rolling, the microphone twirling in his hand. But there was a new quality to his presence now. He wasn't fighting to prove himself anymore. He was leading, commanding, as if the crowd had sworn allegiance. People in the aisles clapped along to the rhythm, their laughter joyous, no longer cruel. Men who had come only to measure the evening in business terms found themselves swept into the excitement. Women in gowns swayed, their jewels catching the light as they moved in time. The entire room pulsed to the same beat, and above it all stood Elvis Presley, no longer the subject of ridicule, no longer a relic to be judged. He was once again what he had always been at his best, a vessel of unfiltered expression, a force that broke through cynicism and spoke directly to something wordless inside the human heart. When the song ended, the applause was instantaneous and deafening, bodies rising from their seats almost as one. It wasn't the staged grandeur of Vegas they were cheering. It was the man himself. Elvis stood still for a moment, letting the ovation wash over him. His chest rose and fell, and though his smile was broad, there was gravity in his eyes. He knew this wasn't just another show. Something had shifted. The balance of the night, and perhaps of his entire return, had tilted firmly in his favor. And though he wouldn't say it aloud, He felt it. The turning point had arrived. The room still buzzed from his declaration, the aftershocks of his words lingering like vibrations on a guitar string. Elvis stepped back, gave a quick nod to the band, and in an instant the orchestra exploded into one of the hardest-driving arrangements of the night. The bass rumbled low, the horns pierced sharp, and the drummer pounded a relentless beat that rattled glasses on tables. The song was Suspicious Minds. The moment those opening bars rang out, the audience reacted as if jolted by electricity. People who had stayed seated through the earlier numbers rose instinctively, clapping to the rhythm. Couples leaned into each other, grinning, swept into the groove. Some of the wealthy men, who had kept their arms crossed earlier, were now loosening their ties, tapping their feet despite themselves. Elvis was no longer contained by the mic stand. He prowled the stage with the energy of a man half his age, his body moving with instinctive grace. Sweat darkened the edges of his collar, and the rhinestones on his suit shimmered like a cascade of stars every time he spun. His voice soared above the orchestra, raw, urgent, commanding. By now, the crowd was his completely. They shouted back lines, clapped in unison, and the showroom had transformed from a cavern of velvet and chandeliers into something closer to a revival tent. The echo of the hall was not polite applause. It was thunder rolling back toward the stage. And yet, even as the collective energy lifted higher, a single discordant note remained. The woman in the silk shawl, now red-cheeked and visibly flustered, attempted to reclaim attention. She laughed loudly at moments where no humor existed, clapping in an exaggerated way that was clearly meant as mockery. The gesture backfired. The guests around her turned their heads with irritation. One man, himself a casino investor, shifted his chair away pointedly, his jaw tight with contempt. Another couple leaned forward to glare at her openly, their patience worn thin. In a room united by music, her gestures made her seem like a caricature of defiance. On stage, Elvis noticed. For a fleeting second, he locked eyes with her. Instead of anger, his expression carried something else, resolve, tinged with a flicker of amusement. Without breaking stride, he changed the phrasing of the chorus, stretching it longer, twisting it with playful improvisation. The band followed, adapting to his lead, turning the familiar into something unexpected. Then, in a move so sudden the audience gasped, Elvis pivoted sharply. He spread his arms wide, cape flaring behind him, his back turned toward the woman. Holding the pose for a full beat, he whipped back around with a grin, snapping into the next lyric as though the stage itself were a boxing ring. The crowd erupted. They understood the symbolism instantly. It was a silent, theatrical reply, more powerful than any insult could be. The ovation swallowed her mockery whole. People stamped their feet, clapped wildly, some whistling until the sound pierced the air. The orchestra, sensing the shift, leaned into the music harder. Horns screamed, drums thundered, the bass thumped like a heartbeat. Elvis danced across the stage, movements precise yet unrestrained, feeding on the roar around him. His performance had become more than entertainment. It was a duel, and every gesture of his body was a strike. By the final chorus, the audience was nearly frenzied. They clapped on every beat, shouting the refrain, their voices rising into a chant that shook the walls. The chandeliers overhead trembled, sending fractured light cascading across the room like shards of brilliance. When the last note crashed, Elvis dropped to one knee, head bowed, chest heaving. The lights dimmed just enough to silhouette his frame, frozen in triumph. The ovation that followed was overwhelming, an avalanche of sound. And through it all, the once smug woman sat rigid, her attempt at mockery shattered by the force of the performance. She was no longer a participant, but a spectator to her own unraveling. The rest of the hall had left her behind, swept into a tidal wave that belonged only to Elvis. For the first time that night, there was no question about his suit, his relevance, his place. The echo of the hall itself answered for him. The thunder of suspicious minds still reverberated through the vast room, but Elvis lifted his palm and signaled the band to still their instruments. The sudden halt was jarring. The final chord hung in the air like smoke, before dissolving into nothing. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the heavy breathing of hundreds who had been swept into his rhythm. Then, absolute quiet. He stood in that silence, shoulders squared, head tilted slightly, as if listening to something deeper than the hall itself. The spotlight pinned him to the center, his white suit glowing against the velvet shadows of the showroom. Not a soul dared to move. Even the sound of glasses being set on tables had ceased. When he finally spoke, his words carried with a weight no melody could equal. "All my life," he began softly, his accent deepening with gravity, "I was told to laugh at what was different. Folks would say, 'Don't take it serious, boy. Just laugh.' But I learned something. A laugh without kindness don't cost a thing, and it sure don't mean a thing either." The sentence sliced through the silence, leaving behind a heaviness that pressed on the chest of every listener. In the second row, the woman in the silk shawl sat motionless. For the first time that night, she didn't attempt a smirk or a remark. Her eyes dropped to her lap, fingers knotting together in a nervous clutch. The mask of superiority she had worn so easily earlier now crumbled in the face of words she could not dismiss. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a lone voice shouted, "We love you, Elvis!" It wasn't staged, wasn't polite. It burst out with such unvarnished sincerity that it cracked the tension like lightning splitting the sky. The hall erupted in cheers, applause surging up once more, this time charged not with excitement, but with devotion. People rose to their feet in scattered clusters, then row by row until the entire room stood, a living wall of support. Elvis did not bask. Instead, he turned slightly to the orchestra and gave them a quiet nod. The conductor lifted his baton and, almost in reverence, signaled a soft, trembling introduction. The strings whispered, the piano dropped in gentle chords, and the room was instantly transformed again, no longer frenzied but hushed with expectation. Elvis stepped closer to the microphone. His eyes scanned the hall, then closed for a moment as the first lines poured from him. "If I can dream of a better land." The words seemed to rise not from his throat, but from somewhere deeper, a place of yearning and bruised hope. His voice was tender yet fierce, a plea wrapped in power. The song filled the space with longing, for peace, for unity, for something higher than show business. The audience was transfixed. Wealthy men with hardened expressions wiped discreetly at their eyes. Women clutched the arms of their companions. Even those who had never cared for him before now felt the pull, a reminder of a truth larger than themselves. The lights dimmed further until only a halo surrounded him, his figure alone in white, singing into the void, as if into the soul of the world. Every lyric seemed carved out of pain and conviction, every sustained note trembling with urgency. And then it happened. People who had entered skeptical or curious or even dismissive began to rise without thinking. One man in the first row stood abruptly, clapping, then another, then entire sections followed. They weren't cheering yet. They were rising in reverence, as though drawn to their feet by something invisible. By the time Elvis reached the final soaring cry of the song, the entire showroom was standing. The ovation, when it came, was not just noise, it was catharsis. People cheered through tears, clapped until their palms burned, shouted his name as if it could carry him higher. On stage, Elvis bowed his head slightly, breathing hard, sweat streaking down his temple. He had given them not just performance, but confession, belief, prayer. And for the first time all night, even those who had come only to mock found themselves unable to resist the truth he had laid bare. Silence had been stronger than words, and the song stronger than silence. The storm of applause that followed If I Can Dream seemed endless. The showroom, once fractured by doubt and derision, was now united in thunderous approval. Guests remained on their feet, clapping, shouting, even stamping their shoes on the carpeted floor in rhythm. Some looked stunned at themselves. These were not the kind of people who normally let their emotions show in public. Yet here they were, crying out for more. Elvis stood still in the center of it all, chest rising and falling with deliberate calm. His head was bowed slightly, dark hair damp with sweat. The collar of his jumpsuit loosened from exertion. He let the ovation wash over him, not rushing to quiet it, not hungry to stretch it. He simply stood, as if absorbing the truth of the moment. At last, the conductor lowered his baton, and the musicians allowed their instruments to rest. Elvis stepped forward, closer to the edge of the stage, so close that those in the first rows felt they could reach out and touch the gleam of his boots. He lifted the microphone, but his expression was different now. No defiance, no showmanship. His eyes softened, his tone quiet enough that the hall bent forward to catch it. "You've been mighty kind tonight," he began, voice husky with fatigue and gratitude. "More kind than I deserve. And before I go, I want to leave you with this thought." He paused, sweeping his gaze across the crowd. Many leaned in, caught in his gravity. Even the woman in the second row, who had mocked him all evening, found herself unable to look away. Her face was pale, lips pressed tight, as though bracing for something she could not escape. "Every one of us wears a suit in this life," Elvis said slowly. "Sometimes it's rhinestones. Sometimes it's a uniform. Sometimes it's the plain clothes of somebody working hard just to get by. But the shine don't matter. What matters is what's beaten underneath." The words rang out with startling simplicity. They weren't polished, not scripted, but they landed like a benediction. For a moment, the entire hall was utterly still, the truth of it sinking deep. Then came the eruption. The audience roared, louder than at any point that night. People stood on chairs, waving their arms. Strangers embraced. The ovation wasn't just for the performance. It was for the man who had transformed ridicule into reverence. At the front, the woman sat frozen, her hands clasped in her lap. For the first time, her posture sagged. The smirk that had carried her through the evening was gone, replaced by something unsettled, even chastened. Her companion clapped heartily beside her, no longer willing to share her disdain. She was alone, and she knew it. Elvis, however, did not linger on her. His gaze swept gently over the room, not in triumph, but in connection. He nodded once, a gesture of thanks, and stepped back. The band struck its closing chord, brass and drums rolling out like a final salute. Elvis bowed deeply, cape falling forward in a sweep of white and gold. The audience screamed his name, a single chant rising from hundreds of throats. "Elvis! Elvis! Elvis!" As he straightened, a man from the front row, an older gentleman in a dark suit, stepped forward impulsively, extending his hand. Security started to move, but Elvis stopped them with a small motion and reached down. Their hands clasped firmly. It was not the handshake of fan and idol, but of equals, of one man acknowledging another on behalf of all present. With that, Elvis turned and began to walk toward the wings. The spotlight followed him for a few steps, then faded into darkness as he disappeared behind the curtain. The applause continued, rolling on as though unwilling to let him go. For those who were there, the memory would never leave. They had come expecting a curiosity, a spectacle to laugh at, maybe even a fall from grace. Instead, they had witnessed something rare, a man reclaiming his dignity not by force or bitterness, but by turning scorn into grace and mockery into music. And though the chandeliers of the International Hotel would glitter over countless more nights of entertainment, none would echo quite like this one. Because this evening had not ended with the glare of rhinestones, but with something far brighter, the last word of a king who knew what truly mattered.